This video is created to show the full autopilot and ILS landing capabilities of the Antonov AN225. Unlike many other long videos out there which shows all startup from power off and full shutdown, the key difficulty initially was to figure out the proper takeoff and autopilot and ILS landing, which was hard to weed through in a very long video. Others' checklist and startup procedures you can follow using the guided checklist. I have chosen a short flight in California, from San Jose International to San Francisco International, which is about a 20-minute flight or less. Now, important thing here first is to make sure you choose a proper flight path. I found out that in the Antonov, sometimes the flight plan doesn't load up correctly. You can see that once the flight is activated and opening up the VFR shows a disconnected plan or other bizarre issues. So the key thing is to choose a plan that is loaded fully without issues. If you follow this same plan, all should work out fine. Now, the main reason for the video is, like I said, the proper takeoff, autopilot settings, and ILS landing. Unlike other commercial Boeing or Airbus aircrafts, this one is a bit different in takeoff, autopilot, and landing. I realized this the hard way. Once I purchased this plane, I end up crashing multiple times without following procedures. Usually I can fly any small or big planes without much effort, but this one needs some attention. 1. Be careful about your flaps and speed. The plane is not very forgiving. Landing and takeoff requires full flaps. 2. Your ascend rate should be well controlled. Notice in the Antonov that max ascend rate is 2,000 feet per second, usually above 1,000 foot climb on takeoff. Sometimes it can even drastically reduce the speed and stall and end up in crash. So on takeoff and pre-autopilot turns, keep an eye on descend rate and speed by checking the speed on the gauge, and it's below the limiter, which changes according to flaps. Now what I'm setting is the ILS navigation for landing. In this case, it's the Arrival Airport Runway 28L. This panel is behind the pilot's seat on the left. The runway frequency is 109.55 and the course is 284. I would recommend setting both left and right same, and once you flip the left/right switch, you can then see the top display above it showing the runway 28L. That tells the system has recognized it correctly. You can also see this on the panel above you. It should also indicate the correct runway on the display above the course. One more important thing here is to make sure your transponder is activated correctly. This is possibly a bug. If you hear the ATC complaining your transponder is not working, usually after takeoff, then this is the issue. So set your transponder to XRNOR and the left knob to on. Okay, now let's get to the initial altitude and speed settings for the autopilot. In this flight plan, as it's a very short flight, I don't intend to be over 4,000 feet and speed at around 250 to 280 knots. We can dial that up with the altitude and speed knobs. Remember, they're in meters and km/h, so do the math. You can also turn the course knob to navigation but don't activate it yet. Once that is done, then let's also adjust the vertical speed to about 800,1000 feet/section. That way when you turn the autopilot, it can hold that climb. Now for both navigation and vertical speed, the corresponding buttons to activate are the ones below it.
Code 1226 heavy, exit runway when able.
Now in the VFR map, you can see our initial plan all looks good. No disconnections. But it's a little tricky as the takeoff direction is opposite to our intended path. So we have to make a proper turn before we activate the autopilot. If you take off and then activate the autopilot, it won't work. The indication is if your plane is close enough, the current path to the next waypoint will usually be in magenta. You will see as soon as we take off, and in less than a minute or so, that magenta will disappear because you are moving away from the flight path. So you have to turn around and get back close to the path, and then activate the autopilot. You will see this is what I will be doing later. Now there is one other procedure that is different in the Antonov than in the Boeing or Airbus. You need to keep the parking brake on and throttle the plane to 70% for 2 minutes. This is to warm up the engines correctly for takeoff. I don't think the simulator cares if you don't follow this. But I'm sure if you're curious and want to go through all the gauges and other things, you will probably notice some things that are not standard if you don't follow the procedure. Might also perform a bit badly during takeoff, which may or may not be noticeable. But let's do that anyway. You will notice on the throttle indicators that it's 70%. The left one shows the intended throttle percentage, and the right one is the actual percentage currently applied on the engine. Because usually due to the lag between setting the throttle and for the engines to catch up. It looks like it's now 71%. I'll pull it back a bit to 70%. It doesn't really matter, I'm sure, with a couple percent difference. Okay, now we're ready to take off. Full power. We will pull up around 140 to 150 knots. The Antonov is pretty heavy, so even with 6 engines, it does take up almost most of the runway. Remember, you can't just yank back like the usual commercial planes. The pitch would be too high, and you will end up losing speed and stalling. So carefully monitor your maintaining speed and climb correctly. Also keep an eye on the speed limit on the flaps. I'll indicate that gauge later. See the gauge there? That orange/yellow needle is the speed limit based on the flaps. We are at full flaps, and our job is to make sure we don't exceed speed too much over it.
Inbound ILS runway, tree 0 left approach. Southwest 107.
Okay, about to take off. Pull back and watch the speed and climb.
2 and calm cleared ILS runway, tree 0 left approach.
If you climb as drastic and speed is going down, then adjust accordingly to make sure you don't stall.
Approach on 1 tree, 4.5. Good day.
Going to 1 tree for
Landing gear up. Keep the flaps full for now.
NorCal approach Antonov Alpha November 225 Heavy is at 1,100 feet, climbing 7,000 feet.
Now remember, I was saying about the magenta line on the flight path. That's disappeared now, as we're now going away from it. Now we have to turn around and catch up. I'm going to do this manually, so you can see how you need to angle the plane so that the magenta line appears again. And that's when we get back to activating the autopilot. Again, I can't insist enough. Keep a keen eye on the speed and climb. It's very easy to lose speed and stall on this plane while turning. You can also do this using the course knob, which is where we set Navig before in the autopilot section. But how well it worked depending on the direction and distance from the initial course is debatable. We're getting close to our intended path. You can see soon it will light up in magenta. You can also use the Garmin Autopilot to do this on your own, but I'm just giving you enough to understand the basics quickly. Yes, the path is now active. Just lit up in magenta. Now is the time for us to activate the autopilot. We already set the knob to navigation. All we need to do is press the activate the main autopilot switch on the left top and activate auto throttle below it, and finally hit the navigation activation switch below the knob. You can see the plane is now turning and adjusting to the navigation.
Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy, you are 28 miles southeast. Maintain present heading and altitude. Expect ILS runway 28 left approach via faith transition. Clear to faith.
Maintain present heading and altitude. Expect ILS runway 28 left approach via faith transition. Clear to faith. Antonov Alpha November 225.
Now watch the speed on the gauge, and it's pretty close to the limit. Now we might have to reduce flaps slowly as we have to get to a higher speed. In this plane, you have to set the flaps one level at a time due to the flight dynamics and its severe weight. I'm just adjusting the speed a bit less to make sure we don't exceed the limit. We can then reduce flaps. Keep an eye on the flap percentage on the right bottom of the screen and also the gauge, where as soon as we reduce flaps, the limit will
Antonov
increase.
Alpha, November 225 Heavy, Oakland Center, altimeter 29.902 radar contact. Continue to divec.
Now we're almost at 0 flaps. Our speed is good. Check the gauge I'm pointing to.
Southwest 1104 Heavy, contact NorCal approach on 120.1. Good day. Antonov Alpha.
I'm just
November
increasing the
225
speed a little
heavy
bit
traffic is
so we
10
can get
o'clock
through a
to
bit
4 miles
quickly.
At 1,800 feet Airbus A20N. Report them in sight.
Antonov Alpha November 225 Heavy, have the traffic.
And you can see increasing altitude too, as there's a small hill up here, and we need about 4,000 feet or so to pass it. The button below the vertical speed knob is the one to activate it. In this plane, I would be careful not to set the climb rate too high. Safe rate is about 800 to 1,000 feet per minute without having a big impact on the speed. You can also set the altitudes for different waypoints in your Garmin GPS, if you prefer. But we won't cover that here, sticking to important basics. Once we get off this little mountain, we will be reducing altitude to about 3,000 feet or so, and then also speed to about 200 knots or so. The landing speed on this is about 160 knots, and the glide slope / ILS altitude for this runway is 3,100 feet. But for this plane, it could be a little tricky to catch the glide slope. So I would set the altitude later around 3,000 feet to catch it. The recommendation is to come from below and catch it.
Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy NorCal, approach altimeter 29.902 radar contact. Continue to dieback.
Now you can see me reducing altitude and speed. Set it correctly for the landing.
Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy, climb and maintain 6,000 feet.
Climb and maintain 6,000 feet. Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy.
Keep an eye on the speed and make sure you don't get above the speed limiter.
Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy, climb and maintain 5,000 feet.
Climb and maintain 5,000 feet. Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy.
Now what I did here is arm the speed brakes. I want to reduce my speed a bit quickly preparing for landing, and maybe also descend a bit faster. So about 50% speed brakes, and bring the speed down, and then turn off the speed brakes. Put down our landing gear. Now we need flaps as speed is reduced. Keep increasing flaps until we get to full flaps, but keep an eye on the speed gauge with the speed limit for every increase in flaps. I turned the speed brakes off. You can see the speed is close to landing speeds, and altitude is coming down to ILS recommended descent point altitude.
November 225 Heavy, descend and maintain 3,100 feet.
Descend and maintain 3,100 feet. Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy.
Remember I told you it's better to catch the glide slope from below it. So I'm setting to 3,000 feet instead of 3,100 feet. Again, speed is set to about 160 knots, which is the landing speed.
Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy. You are 13 miles southeast of San Francisco. Contact San Francisco Tower on 120.5 when inbound.
Tower on 120.5 Antonov Alpha November 225
Now we're at the
Heavy.
waypoint Heman, ready to put the
San
plane in
Francisco
approach
Tower,
mode.
Antonov Alpha
Set one of the
November
black
225
buttons in the
Heavy,
panels
12
below
miles
the
southeast
left of the
inbound ILS
HSI
runway
to
28
capture
left
land.
approach.
Go to the same knob where we did the
Skywest
navigation before.
5287 Heavy,
Now
contact
rotate it to
ground on
approach from
121.8.
navigation. Then hit the button below it to activate.
Antonov Alpha,
Then hit the
November
button on the
225
right next to it to
San Francisco
enable
Tower.
vertical pitch hold so the plane can hold the glide slope. Once that is done, you can see at any moment in the FMC display panels with green letters, it will show that the
ILS
glide
runway
slope
28
is
left
activated
approach
saying
Antonov
on
Alpha
glide
November
slope.
225
If
Heavy.
you don't get this, then you didn't follow the routine correctly or too high above the glide slope, or too low, or too close, or too far away. In San Francisco Airport, the descend point is about 10.1 nautical miles, but it seems to work even a couple miles out. You can see now we're descending and gradually decreasing altitude. Speed is around 160 knots. Now, as this plane doesn't have auto land capabilities, around 100 to 200 feet or so, we will have to turn off autopilot and auto throttle and manually land it. I have not turned them off yet.
United 176 Heavy, turn next taxiway. Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy, follow the Airbus A20N on the runway. Wind calm cleared to land runway 28 left.
Cleared to land runway 28 left Antonov Alpha November 225 Heavy.
San Francisco Tower Skywest Tree 80 Heavy 9 miles southeast inbound ILS runway 28 right approach. Skywest Tree 80 Heavy San Francisco Tower. Altimeter 29.92, wind calm cleared ILS runway 28 right approach. United 176 Heavy, turn next taxiway. United 176 Heavy, contact ground on 121.8.
Keep an eye on the altitude.
Cleared ILS runway 28 right, approach Skywest Tree 80 Heavy.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the autopilot and auto throttle and hand land it now.
San Francisco Tower Skywest Tree 407 Heavy 9 miles southeast inbound ILS runway 28 right approach. Skywest Tree 407 Heavy San Francisco Tower. Altimeter 29.92, wind calm cleared ILS runway 28 right approach. Skywest Tree
Okay,
80
we have
Heavy,
landed.
wind
I have
calm,
bound my
caution
yoke
the
key
Antonov and
to
225,
activate the
landing
reverse
runway
thrust.
28 left.
So ignore me meddling with the
Clear to land
reverse
runway
thrust stick
28
here.
right.
Because of the throttle and other things get in the way, it's sometimes harder to select it. Either way, I got it going with the binding key. And also took the wrong turn after the runway. You have one problem with this plane. After landing, the ground options doesn't come up correctly. Probably a bug. so there will no gates or parking to select. Anyway, good luck on flying the Antonov. I created this flight primarily to indicate the key things about autopilot and ILS landing, which most beginners have trouble with.
Antonov Alpha,
Other things are
November
fairly
225
straightforward.
Heavy, turn next
Seeing you soon
taxiway.
again with my Concorde flight.
Antonov Alpha, November 225 Heavy, contact ground on 121.8.
121.8 Antonov Alpha November 225 Heavy. Goodbye.